There's a moment, subtle, almost imperceptible, where everything shifts. Not in them, in you. It's not when you cry, not when you explain, not when you try harder to reach them. It's when you stop. You stop trying to prove your worth. You stop performing emotional CPR for someone who's been holding their breath since childhood. You stop making your presence feel like a gentle reminder that they are loved, and instead become a mirror they can't escape. This is the shift that makes avoidance spiral. Not because you chased them, but because you didn't. Because for the first time, you stepped off the battlefield and left them to face their own silence. And in that silence, something ancient stirs. You see, avoidants don't fear intimacy because they're incapable of love. They fear it because love feels like danger, like a risk they were taught never to take. So when someone leans in with warmth, they retreat like it's a trap. But when that warmth withdraws, not out of punishment, but power, the nervous system short circuits. Because now they're left with a question they've spent years avoiding. Why do I only feel safe when love disappears? It's a question that doesn't just touch their mind. It cuts through the protective shell, the defenses, the dismissiveness, the calm facade. And what it finds beneath is the very thing they've been running from all along. Longing, vulnerability, the unbearable ache of connection. You were never the problem. You were the trigger, the reminder that the wall they built to protect themselves has also become their prison. But here's what most people miss. Trying to fix an avoidant, to soothe them, to prove you're safe, only confirms their fear. Because the more you bend, the more they recoil. The more you explain, the more they retreat. It's not until you shift, inwardly, quietly, that the dynamic rewires itself. When your energy changes, so does their obsession. They don't understand why they suddenly replay your words, why your absence stings louder than your presence ever did, why the person they couldn't fully open to now lives inside their head. Every hour, every silence, every breath. And that's when the great paradox begins. The very thing they once feared becomes the thing they now crave. So the real question isn't why are avoidants like this? It's deeper, more haunting, more urgent. What kind of presence makes an avoidant stop running? Not because you chased them, but because you didn't? And more importantly, what part of you needed their love to validate your own worth in the first place? Because once that part of you changes, everything else does too. They won't understand what happened, but they'll feel it, and they won't be able to let it go. To understand the depth of the avoidance pull-in-push dynamic, you must first step inside the mind of someone who was taught, not in words, but in the cold absence of them. That closeness is danger, because that's the root. Not preference, not personality, but survival. Avoidant attachment isn't a decision. It's a reflex forged in childhood homes, where love came with conditions, or worse, consequences, where warmth was inconsistent, and vulnerability was met with withdrawal, ridicule, or emotional chaos. Somewhere in those early years, a silent vow was made. I will not need anyone. This is not pride. This is protection. It's how a child learns to stay safe in an environment where emotional openness only ever led to hurt. So they grow up strong on the outside, composed, sometimes even high-achieving. But inside, there's a severed connection, not just to others, but to the parts of themselves that still long to be seen, held, understood. Carl Jung spoke of this internal division, the fragmentation of the self, as the birth of the shadow, the rejected, unaccepted parts of ourselves pushed into the dark, where they do not die, but grow teeth. And for the avoidant, that shadow is heavy with unmet needs. They don't want love any less than anyone else. They just fear it more. Because to accept love means resurrecting the parts of themselves they were forced to bury. To let someone in means confronting the terrifying belief that they are, deep down, unlovable. A belief formed when they were too young to question it and too small to survive without it. That's why your presence unsettled them. It's not because you were too much. It's because your love touched the very wound. They've spent years disguising as indifference. You didn't trigger their disinterest. You triggered their grief. And this is where most people get it wrong. They think the avoidant lacks emotion. But in truth, their emotions are like locked doors behind reinforced steel. There's no key you can offer them. No perfect words, no gentle tone that can force them open. The more you try, the more it confirms their deepest fear. That connection means pressure. That love is a performance. That intimacy is something that can only be earned and never simply received. It's existential. It goes beyond romance, beyond logic. And here lies the greatest paradox. They will crave you the moment you stop trying to convince them. Because when you're no longer trying to gain access, you mirror something radical: self-containment, boundaries, emotional wholeness. And for someone whose psyche has been split for years, that kind of grounded presence is magnetic. Not because it promises to save them, but because it doesn't. You aren't offering healing. You've become the invitation to it. A subtle but seismic shift occurs. Your energy no longer whispers, "Please love me." Instead, it silently declares, "I love myself enough to walk away if you can't meet me." And that terrifies them, not because they don't care, but because for the first time, someone has stepped out of the role they've grown used to. The rescuer, the pursuer, the forgiver. Now they're left with the discomfort of their own reflection, their own avoidance, their own walls, their own ache. And that's when the obsession begins. Not over you specifically, but over the feeling they lost, the calm in your presence, the rare experience of being seen without being asked to perform. You represented something they didn't know they needed, until it was gone. But let's not get distracted. This isn't just about them. It's about you. Because the deeper question isn't just, why are avoidants like this? It's, why did I feel drawn to someone emotionally unavailable in the first place? Is it because their love seemed harder to earn, and therefore more validating? Or was it because something in you learned long ago that proving your worth was the only way to feel wanted? Jung reminds us, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This isn't just about understanding avoidance. It's about understanding why their distance felt familiar, and why their inconsistency felt like home. You never meant to lose yourself. Not when you reached out the first time. Not when you waited for them to open up. Not when you justified their silence by telling yourself they were just processing. But piece by piece, your center shifted. And that's the cost no one warns you about. The quiet erosion of your emotional identity. You start by offering grace, space, compassion. But when nothing comes back, no closure, no clarity, no care, you begin negotiating with your own needs. You silence your longing. You shrink your voice. You walk on eggshells, hoping maybe your softness will be the thing that finally makes them stay. But what no one tells you is that the avoidant doesn't bond with control. They bond with presence. The moment your inner world becomes about keeping them, fixing them, reading between their silences, you become invisible to them. Not because you've done something wrong, but because you've unconsciously stepped into a role they're hardwired to reject. The emotional invader. Even your kindness starts to feel like pressure. Even your patience begins to feel like demand. And worst of all, Your love begins to mirror the very thing they feared as a child, the burden of being emotionally responsible for someone else. And so they pull away. Again, you blame yourself. Again, you try harder. Again, but underneath it all, something sacred begins to fracture. Your intuition, that quiet voice that used to guide you, it's harder to hear now, drowned out by rumination, doubt, and emotional hypervigilance. You read their messages like riddles, replay conversations like detective cases, analyze pauses, emojis, tone shifts, as if decoding them could save you from being discarded. And maybe the worst part? You start confusing anxiety for chemistry, the emotional whiplash, the high highs and low lows, the intensity that leaves you breathless. You tell yourself this must be real, because how else could something so consuming be anything but love? But it's not love. It's trauma reenactment, a subconscious reenactment of the early bonds, where affection was inconsistent and conditional, where love was never just given. It had to be earned, and that familiarity becomes addictive. You chase validation not because you're desperate, but because your nervous system has equated unpredictability with emotional depth. It's not your fault. This wiring was laid down long before you knew what love was supposed to feel like. But here's the paradox. The more you chase an avoidant, the more you confirm their belief that closeness is dangerous. And the more they withdraw, the more you feel compelled to prove you're safe. Round and round it goes. A painful dance. You performing safety, them interpreting intimacy as threat. And in the background, your self-worth erodes, not in dramatic crashes, but in tiny, quiet compromises. Maybe I was too emotional. Maybe I shouldn't have asked that. Maybe if I just give them a little more time. But how much time does it take before you realize that waiting for someone to choose you is a slow form of self-abandonment? You weren't supposed to become their emotional translator. You weren't built to live in someone else's silence. Yet here you are, loving someone who's emotionally locked in, while slowly locking yourself out of your own heart. And that's the tragedy. Avoidance may be afraid of closeness, but you've become afraid of your own needs, your own clarity, your own standards. And somewhere along the line, understanding them became more important than protecting yourself. But what happens when the person you're trying to reach isn't trying to be found? Not because they don't care, but because care, to them, feels like exposure. They don't know how to hold what you offer. They've never learned to. And if you stay too long trying to teach them, you'll forget how to hold yourself. You'll start calling disconnection patience. You'll start calling emotional neglect space. You'll tell yourself that this is what love requires. But real love doesn't require the sacrifice of your voice. It doesn't ask you to prove your worth in the absence of reciprocation. And here's the thing they'll never say out loud. They felt everything. They just didn't know how to feel it with you. And that's not a reflection of your inadequacy. It's a reflection of their fear. But fear is not yours to carry. And silence is not yours to solve. Because while they are off trying to quiet the noise in their mind, you are left holding the weight of their unresolved story. As if love means becoming someone's emotional graveyard. It doesn't. You don't heal by getting them to stay. You heal by finally realizing you never had to become less of yourself to be loved. That's where the rebellion begins. Not in rage, not in revenge, but in reclamation. Reclaiming your voice, reclaiming your instincts, reclaiming the parts of you that you slowly buried, to make space for their avoidance. Because here's the truth no one tells you. You were never too much. You were only too honest for someone who's terrified of being seen. Your vulnerability? It wasn't weakness. It was a mirror, one they couldn't bear to look into. without facing the truth about their own emotional absence. And you were the truth bringer, the one who spoke when they stayed silent, the one who leaned in when they recoiled, the one who offered connection when all they had rehearsed was escape. Of course, they couldn't handle it. Of course, they pulled away. But that doesn't mean you were wrong. It means you were real. And now comes the choice. Not the performative, "I'm done," that waits for them to chase you, but the real choice. The one that doesn't hinge on their reaction. The one that comes from deep within, whispering, "I'm done abandoning myself." Because healing doesn't start when they change. It starts when you stop trying to earn what should have been freely given. You stop chasing breadcrumbs. You stop explaining your worth. You stop believing that if you're just a little more patient, they'll finally become what you need. No, you look in the mirror and see what they could not. A heart that didn't fail. It just fell into the wrong hands. A presence that overwhelmed them because it was whole. And wholeness, it terrifies those who are still fractured. So how do you break free? You stop apologizing for your depth. You stop packaging your emotions into digestible doses. You stop playing small so someone else doesn't feel threatened by your light. Instead, you learn to sit with the discomfort that comes when you no longer bend to someone's unreadiness. You learn to name your needs and not flinch when they go unmet. You learn to leave, not out of spite, but out of sacred self-respect. And here's the paradox. When you stop trying to be safe for the avoidant, you finally become safe for yourself. You become the anchor you were searching for in someone else. You come home, to your body, to your breath, to the parts of you that learned to dim their brilliance just to be tolerated. And one day, when they reach back out, as they often do, not with clarity, not with transformation, but with nostalgia and subtle pull, you'll feel something new. Not excitement, not longing, but distance. Because clarity creates distance. And when your heart is clear, even their most emotionally charged silence won't seduce you back. Because you'll remember, the silence they live in is not your responsibility to decode. The emotional maze they walk is not yours to navigate. You were never supposed to be their therapist, their rescuer, their emotional translator. You were supposed to be loved, fully, freely, and without delay. So let them go, not with bitterness, but with truth. Let them stay in the waiting room of their own unreadiness. Let them learn, in their own time, or perhaps never, that love was never about control, but presence. And you return to your center, your truth, your depth. Not everyone can meet you there, and that's okay. Because when you live in your fullness, you stop begging to be understood by those still living in fragments. That's your rebellion. That's your power. There comes a moment, after the anger, after the silence, after the space they begged for, where you stop waiting for them to come back. Not because you've become cold, not because you've stopped caring, but because you've remembered who you are outside their absence. This is the moment most avoidants never expect. The one shift they cannot control. You no longer orbit their pull-push cycle. You no longer perform your worth. You no longer send messages into the void, hoping this time they'll respond differently. Why? Because you've finally understood. You were the gravity. You were the stillness, the warmth, the meaning. You were what they kept returning to when the noise of disconnection became unbearable. But they never told you that. They couldn't. To admit your power would threaten the one illusion they held on to, that they didn't need anyone. That closeness was weakness. That detachment was control. But the truth? You haunted them, not with drama, not with demands, but with presence, with the message they couldn't unhear, with the gaze that saw them when they couldn't see themselves, with the consistency they never gave yet always relied on. Even in their silence, especially in it, you were there. A ghost of everything they secretly longed for but couldn't hold. And now? Now, you're no longer available. Not physically, not energetically, not emotionally. And this is where the obsession begins. Not because you manipulated, not because you punished, but because you disconnected with dignity. You see, avoidants don't chase you when you beg. They chase when you shift, when your energy no longer leans in, when your nervous system isn't anchored to their inconsistency, when your peace becomes louder than their chaos. They don't know how to name it, but they feel it. The void where your warmth used to be. Suddenly, the things they once dismissed become vivid. Your silence is no longer permission, it's power. Your distance isn't punishment, it's protection. Your absence isn't a tactic, it's truth. And here's the final truth that changes everything. You never needed them to choose you to be whole. You only needed to choose yourself, without apology. This is what terrifies them. Not your emotions, not your standards, not your voice, but your freedom. Because when you're free, truly, internally, energetically free, you're no longer touchable by their push-pull dynamic. You no longer fall for recycled moments. You no longer mistake their nostalgia for growth. And that's when they come crawling back, drawn not to manipulate, but to reattach to the very light they dimmed. But this time, you see it clearly. Their return isn't proof of love. It's proof of the gravitational pull of someone who healed. You don't let them back in just because they miss you. You don't open the door just because they knock. You ask the harder question. Is this version of you willing to stand beside the version of me I fought so hard to become? And if the answer is no, you smile softly. You walk away fully. You leave no wound behind, only wisdom. And now, for you, watching this, perhaps feeling every line like a mirror, there is one thing left to do. Choose yourself in the places they abandoned you. Choose yourself when their silence echoes. Choose yourself when their return tempts you. Choose yourself when your nervous system remembers the chaos and wants to go back. Not out of love, but out of habit. Break the habit. Choose the path that leads you back to your center, to your calm, to your clarity. And if this spoke to you, not just as content, but as truth, then stay with this space. Because here, you are not asked to shrink. You are not asked to wait. You are not asked to perform. You are asked to awaken. So if you're ready to keep uncovering the unconscious, the attachment wounds, the unspoken grief, and the return to wholeness, subscribe, watch what's next, and never forget, they didn't lose you when they walked away. They lost you when you found your worth in silence.